Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a simple question with a not-so-simple answer, and that is, are the 23-24 San Jose Sharks going to be a better team than they were last year? And I think a lot of people are going to look at this question and immediately think one thing, which is absolutely not. The Sharks are going to be so much worse than they were last year, and this is primarily led by the fact that the most recent memory in people's minds about what the Sharks have done this offseason is the Erik Karlsson trade from a couple of weeks ago, where they picked up essentially scraps from the Penguins and the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for the 101-point defenseman who just won the James Norris. And of course, if you take a look at solely that trade in a vacuum, disregarding any other moves made this offseason, just Karlsson in exchange for Granlund, Hoffman, and Ruda, it is quite clear from just that trade that the Sharks got worse off from that move. However, there were multiple other additions made this offseason that could potentially shift things in a different direction. So if we actually take a look at the key losses and key additions here made during this offseason by Mike Grier, we have Erik Karlsson, of course, leading the list, but besides him, the only other two key losses, and these players are not even in the same universe as Erik Karlsson, are Noah Gregor, like a bottom six player who I guess was pretty decent, as well as James Reimer, who is a pretty replacement level goaltender who was extremely bad this past season. Otherwise, players like Gadjevich, Svechnikov are very much irrelevant, I would say, for the Sharks going into next season. But if we actually take a look at key additions, we could see that there are a lot of, maybe not the biggest names, but NHL players for sure that the Sharks did add to the roster. Duclair, Hoffman, Granlund, Zadina, Kyle Burroughs, Jan Ruda, as well as a new goaltender, Mackenzie Blackwood too. And so with all of these additions against the pretty much only one major loss, while none of these players are individually anywhere near as good as Erik Karlsson, when you combine all of their impact together, could the Sharks potentially be a better team than last season? It's actually a much more interesting question than one might think. Let's actually take a look first at the forward group, because this is likely where the Sharks underwent the greatest impact this offseason, because if we take a look at the key losses, Karlsson is a defenseman, so that's something we'll get to a bit later. In terms of forwards, your only real loss is Noah Gregor, who is probably worse than most of the other forwards that the Sharks actually added this offseason. And so if we take a look at the top 12 that the Sharks were icing quite frequently last year, it featured players like Gadjevich, Svechnikov, Nick Bonino, Oscar Lindblom, Steven Lorentz. These are players who at best are fourth liners and at worst are players who don't even belong in the NHL at this point. And the Sharks are going to be replacing those players with players like Duclair, Granlund, Hoffman, Zadina. And at worst, any of those players like a Zadina might be like a fourth liner at worst, while there's players like Duclair who could easily be a top six player, if not even a first line forward if things go well for him. Granlund, a very solid middle six kind of guy, and Hoffman, depending on if he rebounds or not, could either be like a power play specialist who plays on the third line or potentially even a top six option. And so generally, just taking a look at this off-season, the Sharks have gotten significantly better from a forward perspective. However, it can't be just fully looked like in that regard, because it is not just this off-season that we need to look at, but actually the losses that the Sharks sustained this past season in general. And that, of course, comes down to the Timo Meier trade from last trade deadline. Because while the Sharks' top six was genuinely awful through the last quarter of the 22-23 season, through the first three quarters of it when Timo Meier was on the team, it was still pretty bad. It still had, Matt Nieto on a pretty consistent basis, which should just never happen for an NHL team, but certainly not as bad as you might think, because Timo Meier was a very good player. And even the best of the Sharks additions this offseason, which is likely to be Anthony Duclair, perhaps maybe Mikael Granlund if he can rebound, is still miles worse than what Timo Meier was able to bring to the San Jose Sharks. So I don't think there is a massive gap between this year's forward group and last year's forward group, but I will say that at the end of the day, it is probably at the very least a small notable improvement. On on top of that, it should be mentioned as well that last season the Sharks did not dip into their rookie prospect pool at all until the last quarter of the season, where they decided to give certain players an opportunity to show themselves in a few games, like Eklund, Bordeleau, Robbins, Gushin, Thrun, all of these types of players. But going into next season, depending on how things end up, the Sharks could have one, if not a couple, of rookie forwards come into the lineup and actually have a long-term impact for the San Jose Sharks this upcoming season. The obvious primary candidate for that would be William Eklund, but who's to say a player like Bordeleau, like Gushin, even like an outside chance of a Philip Bystedt can't outperform people during preseason and perhaps make an impact? You never really know. So that could be another option for how the Sharks forward group can improve, because still Eklund becoming a long-term forward this season is still better than the Sharks' worst forward that they were icing last year, like a Oscar Lindblom or a Jona Gadjevich. When it comes to the defensive side of things, this is obviously where the Sharks took their biggest hit. Erik Karlsson losing the technically best defenseman last year. It's never going to be an improvement in that regard for this team, but it may not be as massive of a drop-off as some people think. It is quite clear that from an offensive perspective, defensively, the Sharks have gotten significantly worse. I would be surprised if any Sharks defenseman next season put up more than, let's say, 30 points, which is likely going to be primarily assists happen to be picked up from the fact that the forwards are managing to score goals. Matt Benning is not even going to have half the points of what Erik Karlsson managed to put up this last season. But when it comes from a pure defensive standpoint, it's not as though necessarily that Erik Karlsson brought a ton of that element to the Sharks game. You see, Erik Karlsson's best, quality defensively was the fact that he played primarily in the offensive zone. He essentially took the cliche of the best defense is a good offense to heart and made it so that, 70% of the time, that's a completely random statistic, but 70% of the time, Erik Karlsson was playing in the offensive zone compared to the defensive zone, and so he never really had to defend. But I think every Sharks fan at this point would admit that when Erik Karlsson was indeed forced away from the puck and was playing in the defensive zone, that if you didn't really pay attention to the fact that it was Erik Karlsson, you'd notice a defenseman who honestly wasn't all that great. His defensive positioning was at times quite subpar, and he wasn't super willing to commit to actually making defensive plays and was usually trying to spin things in an offensive way himself. He wasn't clearing the front of the net. Instead, he was standing in front of the other team's forwards who are screening his goaltender to try and maybe block the shot up high and make the transition play to get back to offense immediately. And the Sharks adapted their style of play to allow Erik Karlsson to succeed in this regard. They would quickly blow the zone so Karlsson could have the opportunity to make that first pass. They would constantly support him in the offensive zone so that the puck can be kept alive as often as possible. And these are not the same type of concessions that the Sharks are likely to make for their defensive core going into next season. And so a big thing that is going to be the major question is how David Quinn is going to adapt his system going into that next season, because like I said, it's quite clear that they cannot run the same type of style as they were doing when Erik Karlsson was able to play, 25 to 30 minutes of ice time per night. And so on paper, this Sharks defensive core looks really bad, probably bottom 5 in the entire league, at best maybe bottom 10 in the entire league, but they're all guys who can commit somewhat at the very least defensively, and if the Sharks can set them up into a system to succeed, while it won't be good, it may not be as bad as expected, which can sort of help shield the massive fall-off that you would expect from the departure of a player of Erik Karlsson's caliber. And then when it comes to the goaltending situation, yes, I wouldn't say that Blackwood on paper is much of an upgrade over James Reimer. Both of these goaltenders struggled mightily this past season to actually have any sort of impact positively for their team. And both Blackwood and Reimer in the past have managed to show solid performances, but there was no real indication that they would manage to do that going into the next season. So while I'm not going to be able to sit here and say, well, the Sharks goaltending is notably better, it's objectively better. What I can say is that it is going to be very difficult for the Sharks goaltending to actually get any worse than it was last year. They were amongst the worst teams goaltending wise last season, probably bottom 3, if not the literal worst. And that was primarily because a player or a goaltender like Kaapo Kähkönen was putting up a close to 4.0 goals against average, which is just kind of hard to imagine that he'll end up in a similar situation. Can the Sharks goaltending still be bad next year? Perhaps, and it maybe even is likely that it is still to be bad, but will it be as bad? That is definitely more difficult to imagine. And so at the end of the day here, when we circle back to the question, are the Sharks a better team or not than last season? There are tons and tons of factors to consider. The forwards, I would say, are at least slightly better, if not a decent bit better than last season, even when you include Timo Meier on the team. The defense is notably worse with the departure of Erik Karlsson, but can commit more so to a defensive style that they had to avoid trying to play with Erik Karlsson, which could help shield the otherwise relatively even goaltending that the Sharks have going into next season. However, there is one more thing that we do have to consider, is that we cannot really just consider the Sharks playing in a vacuum. They're not playing against some AI, some robot where they're going to be able to just get an objective overall of how their score is. It's not as though they go to the NHL and they say, okay, you had an overall of 73 last season. This year you have an overall of 74, so you are notably a better team. You see, you have to compare yourself to the rest of the field, and so everything is essentially just relative. The Sharks were the 4th worst team last season, but even if they came in with the exact same squad, there is no saying that they would end up still being the 4th worst team, because other teams have improved around them. And so if we take a look at last season, there were a lot of teams that were essentially just trying to lose games, like the Blackhawks, like the Anaheim Ducks, so that they could get the best possible placement in the draft lottery. And for those two teams, it ended up working out exceptionally well. But going into next season, you don't really have that same Connor Bedard sweepstakes, and so the teams are not as incentivized to try and be as terrible as possible. So teams like the Chicago Blackhawks, like the Anaheim Ducks, like the Columbus Blue Jackets, like the Detroit Red Wings, all of these teams have improved in different measures over this past offseason. And so the Sharks do have to kind of compare themselves to that field. So at the end of the day, even if the Sharks have, let's say, finished 4th last again next season, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are at the same level. It's possible that they got better just as the rest of the field did, but I will say at this point, it's probably not as obvious of an answer to this question, and I would honestly say not to be surprised if the Sharks, while not going to make the playoffs, if they end up finishing, let's say, 5th, 6th, maybe even 7th last in the league next season. Class dismissed.